All right, so Quadrant community call. Welcome everybody. So as I mentioned, we've got quite a lot of stuff in the backlog. I've thrown a couple of things that I think are worth discussing into today's minutes, but sorry, something dropped on the floor there. But if there's something that someone wants to prioritize, maybe put up your hand and we go from there. I'm just going to ask one question then. Alex, the well-known attributes, I see that's just dropped in there at the end, and I know Guy is quite keen to get that merged. So
yeah, me too. I didn't want to just, so we can absolutely discuss that one. I don't know how many of much interest. It's implementation detail, but it's important implementation detail.
Well, we can give a little background first, maybe, of what that is. If you want me to give a quick overview. So just so that everybody on the call understands what exactly it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe Guy should introduce that.
Or Guy, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to make it quick and simple. Basically, in the different policies that we have, and most importantly, the rate limit policy and the alt policy, the user often has to refer to dynamic values that is known to exist in the context of enforcing that policy for one particular request, right? Things such as the HTTP path of the request, the host name, or attributes of the request in general, but also other attributes that are not necessarily associated with that particular request, but are available in the context, right? And we used to have one way to express those in a rate limit policy, and a different way to express those in an alt policy, right? Related to the different protocols and interfaces that we rely on to implement those from Envoy, right? So this is an effort to try to consolidate and standardize those into one single seamless language that the user can refer to the specification and know basically how to write in one of those policies. And since Envoy, the Envoy proxy, does specify a set of so-called well-known attributes, we decided to build on top of that, right? And that also happens to be the same attributes that any WAS module, in theory, can request to the host when it's loaded within the Envoy environment, right? That list of Envoy attributes. Something yet to be confirmed because we didn't test all of them, right? So that is as stated in the Envoy documentation. But so far, so good. We implemented for rate limit policy v2, and all the attributes that we tried, they pretty much work by just requesting those by name to the host, right? Something needs to be adapted, to be changed in the alt part of things as well, because they do not coincide with how the same attributes, even though there's a big overlap between the set of attributes with support for rate limiting and for alt, but they are not identical. The part that is in the overlap, even so, they are not named equally in those two different components. So there's some work we need to do in the alt part as well to make sure we follow the same names and the same patterns, the same language basically that we are defining in that RFC, and it is already implemented somehow for the rate limit policy. The problem we need to discuss is that in regards to the data types of those attributes and those values, right? And effectively the data that you can retrieve depending on the different environments, right, that we are requesting the data, depending on whether it's a WAS module requesting that to a WAS host, or if that is a value that was passed in a gRPC request to an external authorization service, for example, right? Some of the types of those attributes are simple, basic data types, right? Such as strings or integer numbers, right? Or Boolean values. But some are more complex data structures, such as arrays and even maps, including nested maps. So what we are discussing there is basically the limits, right, to supporting all those different data types, but also validating if we need to support all those data types. Is this okay for an introduction and contextualization, Alex?
Yep.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I'm looking at this from a data flow perspective. So, but let's start with the WASM, just to be very precise. So, one, like a WASM module loaded inside a proxy that supports the proxy WASM API, the signature is you pass like tokens, and from there you get an array of bytes back. That's what you get. What is to be made of that byte array is, quote unquote, your module's problem. So right now we're only concerned with envoys. So let's ignore what others may be doing. So correct me if I'm wrong, Auguste, because you may have changed that, but I don't think you did. As of now, we just consider everything is a string. So the stuff that we tested are strings. Envoy encodes arrays of strings with null terminated string items, right? But then there is more types that exist, as Guy said, right? And as you can easily imagine, so none of the encoding none of the actual property names are spec'd. The encoding, not spec'd. So you get bytes back, do whatever you want with them. And so understand those bytes. So that's one part of the issue. So we need to make sure that we support whatever comes out of the host in a way that the proxy WASM module that we load could understand. But then what is it that we do with that? And so in the case of limitador, that set of data gets sent as descriptor entries to limitador to then evaluate conditions. But envoy, did I say something wrong?
Well, you said conditions. Since rate limited policy v2, that is no longer the case, right? We never transpose. I'm
going to get to that.
Okay.
So yes. So in the case of Kuadrant, this is as of now true, but there is yet more buts to come. So if that data needs to make it there, we need to have a string representation for all that stuff. So that's part of what this concerns itself with. But why would you, right? So there's a bunch of things that you don't even need to do that you could absolutely sort at the wasn't shim layer already. There's two exceptions that I know of as of now. One we're about to introduce with the data type, and that's the timestamp. So time is state. If you say that your gateway is as up-to-date time, the correct time, whatever that means, actually, correct time, whatever that means for your notion of time, then you can also evaluate things at the proxy level. The other one, the only one that I can think of is actually the state of your counters. And they might be a thing where this becomes important if you have a property for that I forgot the name of, but effectively sets what is the increment or whatever, right? Should it be one? Should it be something else? You reserved it for future use, I think is what you said. So that would be another one. These are the two only reasons why you would need to push that data that I can think of to limitador. So advanced features could only be supported if you run the wasm shim, and we wouldn't need to break the rate limiting protocol support. I guess only limit ourselves to the rate limiting protocol as defined by Envoy. We wouldn't need to extend it, nothing to be done. Because that's another way of supporting all the issues that we have here. Now, the one thing that's unclear to me, where I'm turning back to Yugi, is the data flow thing when we want to, because I think we can all flatten it down at some point, meaning that if you have something very complex expressed somewhere in Authorino, right, you retrieve the data that you care about and you just, I don't know, make a key value pair out of it and push it down back again. Based on the operators that we will want to support, that might be another one. So stuff like contains for sets. I guess when I say sets, I mean keys in maps or arrays of things. There's yet more, but I think based on the discussion we have, all of those cases would be covered with the literals effectively, because all flattens down to a string. So yeah, I guess asking you, Guy, there, is my assumption correct for all auth that if anything needs to happen post auth, we can just, make up key value pairs that we...
I think so. I've just recently posted a reply to your comment in the pull request, where I'm trying, to elaborate that for the record, the whole story, and trying to agree with your point. I think so, right? Given the capabilities we have, either in an old policy or in any other way that users might want to export metadata and make them available to the rate limiting in a rate limited policy, right? Such as by manually configuring a Lua filter, for example, right? All those different ways, to configure metadata to be exported and make them available are powerful enough, to do this kind of stuff, right? To reduce a bigger problem or a more complex data structure into a simpler one, so you can write, simpler rules and assert for things like if this equals that, right? This kind of stuff. So I think so. I think we can live with that, given the use cases we know, right? I think it's fine. I think it's okay. So I have no problem at all, right, with that. Only to stress a little bit more and make sure that there is indeed no problem. I want to make sure that everybody understands the distinction between what happens in Limitador and what happens in the WASP machine, right? Because so far, we are in a relatively safe position regarding what happens in Limitador, because only very simple things happen in Limitador right now, right? So there are not any kind of complex conditions that need to be evaluated in Limitador. We basically only have a very limited set of operators that we support there. And even within that set of operators, the only one Kuadrant really uses as of today, it's the equality one, right? It checks if something is equals to another. And other than that, we only need those dynamic values to define, as Alex said, the qualified counters, right? And then that is indeed important, right? Because if there is any precision, for example, difference between one value or the other that you pass, right, you can end up activating a completely different counter in Limitador. So it is very important that we make sure that we know the data type we are passing to Limitador. As far as I know, the things we need to interpret today in the WASP machine to convert it into a rate limiting payload are only simple things. And therefore, there is no need for concern about, we running into problems in Limitador. I think we're safe. I think we're good, right? And so leaving us only with the part of what has to be done in the WASP machine and what the WASP machine can do, right? I think Alex already covered very well about the parsing of that string of bytes and making sure we are able to interpret, depending on the different attributes, what is the actual data type, right? And I think so far we only have strings, mostly strings, and I don't even remember if we do have cases of numbers or or Boolean values, or those are just hypothetical. But even so, I think even with the 3 data types, I think it should be easy enough to interpret based on the well-known attributes, the attributes we know, right? There will always be a set of attributes that we do not know, because they are by definition open strings. It depends on each case, right? For example, a user can define in the auth layer a property to be exported, to be propagated to the rate limiting service that happens to be a data obtained from an external source of metadata. And we don't know what that is. It could be just a string-fied JSON object, right? If the user needs to navigate that as a proper object, and access data deep down, then we are potentially in trouble. So my proposal is that if we need to identify any data types other than string, let's stay with the simpler ones, like Boolean, numbers, no more than that, and all the rest is treated as a string. And let for the user to rely on the capabilities of those other services to try, to simplify the problem, and therefore also the implementation.
One caveat to what you said, right? So right now, other than the property itself in the WASM shim, there is no other way for you to infer the type, just to be clear, right? You get a byte back, right? What does it represent, right?
Yeah, we could, yeah, I think the most obvious thing to do would be defining the data, the well-known attributes within the WASM machine, right? Making the WASM machine aware of those attributes. But we still have another option, would be come up with their own type system, right? And treat everything as a string, and then and parse that.
Yeah, for extent, that, or
similarly to how
like,
the metadata does, yes.
Yeah, or have, like, you could have full-blown protobuf in there, right? Like, it's...
Yep. That too, yep.
But so what I think I hear, what I would do is ignore the extension type, like, right, for the open stuff right now, it needs to be, let's say, a string. If it gets pushed down all the way to the WASM shim, agree on that, right? So people need to maybe extract a more complex data structure into 3 individual key values, right? That's for the extension stuff. But then I think what we should do, and sorry, you probably don't realize, but I'm mostly looking at Agus because it's been mostly us two in there. I think what we need to do is what we said, right? Have this mapping of known ones to whatever types there is, and supporting the... I only looked into how arrays are serialized, but we need to look into the entire thing and make test cases and whatever. But thanks to all your work, Agus, we can do that. And support like the different data structures that we want to support for now. That shouldn't be too much work. Just syncing with whatever the C++ code base and Envoy tells us that we need to do. And then have that mapping sort of in an open way, right? So that if we ever live inside another proxy host, WASM host or proxy or whatever, right? We can sort of replace that and not... So I contain all of that in a single file somewhere and not spread it all over the code base, I guess. And then we consider that enough for this iteration. Does that sound good? Am I missing something?
I have one comment on what you said, but,
yes,
but Iguski has been waiting for a while. I think I even saw him raising his hand, if I'm not mistaken. So, no? Okay. Anyway, please feel free to interrupt at any point. But you said make sure that we only, whatever we export to the rate limiting, it's always a string. It can be like that, right? But one thing is what we export. Another thing is how we read that on the other end, right? So the main use case we have for this is the old service exporting metadata that will later be read by the rate limiting, by the WASM shim to be passed to or not to the rate limiting service. And right now, the Authorino, the authorization service, can pretty much export any JSON data type, right? So it's compatible with any JSON data type, including complex structure. We could change that, right? That would require implementing in Authorino something specific for when you are exporting data for the rate limiting service. Because right now it relies on some generic functionality to basically propagate data back into the Envoy metadata chain. If we do, another thing would be, another way would be, let Authorino keep doing what it does, right? Not enforcing that the values of those maps are always strings, right? The user can do that, right? If the user so wants to. But I'm actually talking about the Authorino enforcing those to be always values when you know those are meant for the rate limiting service, right? Or in the WASM shim, treat everything that it gets from a property always as a string. But then there is one ambiguity that we need to address, which is when it is actually a string, that will it start with like a comma character? Is that part of the string, or that is not part of the string? You know what I mean?
But what case are you thinking about? Because the one that I'm thinking about is the one you mentioned before, which is the qualified counters, right? So it's like two properties that we need. Yes, it needs to be a valid UTF-8 string, because otherwise that's going to be an issue. But that we can enforce. But also it needs to be, I'm not sure how to call it, like repeatable, predictable, like always the same, right? If you invert two fields, it's still the same. Say you have a map with foo and bar, two keys, right? If it's foo bar, it's fine. But if it's bar foo as a string, it's not going to be the same string. It's going, and as you said, you're going to end up using a different counter, right? So, so if we can enforce the latter, well, if we can make sure the latter is always true, that the string representation like is, I'm not sure, symmetric or whatever the mathematical word is for that, right? So it's always that. Then we're good, right? It doesn't matter that we know the type per se, because everything's a string. The only problem you could have is somebody reusing a value from that, like foobar, right? And also using foobar, and now you end up using the same counter again. These are the two issues I can think of.
No, it totally makes sense. I see the following ways, that this could be addressed. I mean, we don't do anything, and we just document that and say to the user, if you are defining an alt policy for something that is meant for the rate limiting, then this, hopefully, we will have some better UX in the future that kind of makes things consistent always. But until we don't, right? The user would have to write in the alt policy something that is known to be always interpreted as a string, right? That is one way, just document it. Another one is try to enforce something in the alt service that whenever it's meant the rate limiting, it ensures such, symmetry or identity, right, between values as you described. But that would require a change in the authorization service to make that functionality, or to create a special case of that functionality that currently exists to propagate metadata back, aware that metadata is meant for the rate limiting, effectively making another type of auth response called rate limiting, something like that, right? Instead of just the way you wrap that response, right? Currently, you can tell in an auth policy, I want this piece of response data to be injected as a request header, right? This is one way. Another way is I want this to be returned back to Envoy as an Envoy dynamic metadata, which is what we use to propagate that data to rate limit, right? We would require.
Sorry to interrupt. Just want to make sure I understand, because the first one, correct me if I'm wrong, but we know that's going to be a valid string, the header. Yes. The latter, though, we don't, right? It's whatever.
Correct. Yes, because both Authorino allows you to build whatever kind of complex data structure, and also Envoy allows to receive any kind of data structure in that
Right.
well-known metadata thing.
But what we could do is cheat a bit and don't do anything there, deal with it at the wasm shim level, and I don't know, base 64 encode the freaking byte thing, right? So for as long as you provide us a reproducible, whatever again the word is, byte array, it'll be fine. It'll be documented because that's probably not what people would expect. But that would suffice as a qualifier for the counters, though. So if you want to qualify by your user object, whatever's in there, right? It works. It'd be very non-efficient, but they would work.
Qualifiers are the main source of concern here because it affects both, in the WASM machine, but it can lead to some serious trouble in limitador. But because we're talking about the WASM machine, it also extends to conditions, right? There are also some conditions you may want to write, such as when the identity that the auth service extracted contains a claim called admin and the value is equals to true, right? Let's say you only want to activate a given limit when the user is an admin or not an admin, right? This kind of stuff.
Yeah, but for now, we could sort of bypass that and just make it not working, right? It would just plain out fail, tell you, hey, I don't know how to navigate that thing and address that in the future. I was actually mostly concerned about not too easily enabling users to shoot themselves in the foot. And qualified counters, by the way, like the latest examples I got from Peter, actually, they're again misunderstood, right? It seems like to be the one feature that confuses everybody in limitador.
I'd love to hear more about that later, some other time, because right now I'm working on a documentation for the rate limitables V2, and I was writing exactly that section of the document describing how the counter qualifiers work. So it would be good to know.
Let me know once you have anything. We will gladly read it and foolproof it for you.
Gus?
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask because I got confused after all the discussion. I wanted to focus on the WASM machine, how it reads the properties. As Alex said, the properties are byte array. And so, what if the property defined in the WASM configuration leads to some value which is not a string, like an integer, like an array, like something else? As you know, the byte encoding of an integer is different from a string. So how are we going to deal with it? I heard something about having a mapping from a well-known set of attributes, so we can only use them. But that sounds to me that we are limiting ours. Maybe for first implementation is good, but we are like kind of limiting users to set some not only conditions but also the descriptor entries. We use for the audience, for the context, we use the properties for matching conditions, but also to build those descriptor entries. So yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I'm not trying to answer that. So I'm not exactly sure I understood what you said, but I'll try to cover everything. And if I miss something, you'll tell me.
Okay.
So you don't know, right? When you ask for property, it's those tokens, you get some bytes back, and it's up to you to make sense out of them. There is no real way in the way that Envoy gives you the answer to know what is the type. So you need to know what kind of type you're expecting. So that's the one thing that I want to map in code in the WASM ship. I can work on that, no worries. So that's one. Then, as you said, for the descriptor entries, the idea is to do what we were discussing in the issue, so the idea is to have literals for a limited set of types. I think we'll go through it'll be dictated by this mapping file, right? So there's going to be arrays that I know. There is timestamp that I know too. and there is
Integers.
map. And there is integer? Well, integers. So the good thing is that for all of those, so that's one of the reasons I was a bit of a pedant with the kind of things you could use in the condition language, is because now we can, like, even for full data structures, right? We could have navigating operators and so forth. So we'll map those as literals. So they'll make it as literals to, like, string literals of whatever type represented as a valid, because that's another important thing to understand. Like, Rust will not let you create a string that's not a valid UTF-8 sequence, right? It'll blow up. So back to your question, if today because I think what we have right now is we expect everything to be a string. If you try to reach something else and it so happens to not be a valid UTF-8 byte sequence, it's gonna panic, right? That's what's gonna happen today.
Well, it's not going to panic because we have a safeguard there for if it doesn't. Yeah, but
the point being, you're screwed. Effectively, you lose the
yes,
data, right?
yes.
And
Actually, but my point being, everything in the rate limiting service protocol needs to be a string. The descriptor entry and descriptor value, both are strings defined by the spec.
Yep.
So if we, in the WASM scene, if we read something that is not a string, we need to
stringify.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so the idea is to make them like have literals for all the types. So, strings are supposed to be quoted. Numbers, just a number. What the square brackets for the arrays?
In the WASM configuration, you specify the type looking at the WASM configuration.
No, based on the host, I think that will need to happen. But I'll make a proposal for that.
Okay.
I have an idea. So I would just have a mapping file. It leaves one question open, though, which is the extended properties, right? We discussed that. If you put a property in there and we don't know what it is, what should happen? And that then we need possibly, like, the same is true for the conditions, by the way, because if you have operators, now all of a sudden you also need to have some kind of a, possibly like a casting mechanism or whatever, right? Like foo.bar, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know what it is. I need to know what is there because less than or whatever has a very different behavior depending on whether we're comparing timestamp strings, right?
But in the property selector, you specify a path.
Yes.
And the type, you said the type would be, if it's a string, between quotes. If it's an integer, is nothing.
No, that would be for the value stringified.
But that's in the condition. And what about in generating the descriptors? In generating the descriptors, we have selector.
But
nothing else.
Yeah, but back to the point that Guy mentioned, right? So if you go navigating into La La Land and we don't know, either we don't support it, period, for now, or it needs to be a proper string and we only support, you need to point us to a string. However you get a string there, that would be another way of supporting that. And then opening the type system, then yes, Agus, I think you're right. We will need to have something that somewhere somebody defines foobar is a string, or sorry, is an integer or whatever, right?
A new field in the WASM configuration selector.
I guess I would put it there. But for now, I would make only the mapping based on the host, and the only host we're supporting is an envoy. So it would be like this list of properties to their types. Yeah, that's my proposal. That's
okay. I'll mute.
We already passed half of our time here, and we have all the items in the agenda. So I'm going to ask just one last question very quickly. Do you guys think that we need to change modify anything in the current RFC, the current text of the RFC, based on things we discussed today, or are we good? Because all I wanted, and the reason why I brought this up earlier today or yesterday, was because I'm working on the documentation for Real Impulse v2, and I want to refer to that well-known selectors RFC page, right? If there's anything there that can later be enhanced for further clarification, or I mean, it's effectively depends on each implementation, depending on if you're talking about the rate limiting or the auth service, then I'd say move on and let's merge it, or just add whatever we need to add there so we can close that, and then keep on discussing for the specifics for the implementation. How does that sound? Okay,
Sounds good to me.
cool. Okay, Alex. Sounds good to me too. Good.
Okay. I tried to capture some of that, Alex. I don't know the full intricacies as well as you do. Maybe you could add a little more detail if I've missed some stuff.
I'll summarize. I don't have the doc open right now, but yes, I will. I think it's pretty clear in my head what we decided.
Awesome. Okay, Paul, CNCF.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, so just to set some context, a couple of weeks ago, I was having conversations with Thomas with respect to community building and trying to build a community around the Kuadrant project and try to focus on engagement and adoption around it. So one of the line items that came up from that discussion was the possibility of applying to the CNCF. So for those of you who are unaware, CNCF is Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's part of the Linux Foundation, and it's a vendor-neutral hub that hosts projects or open source projects such as Kubernetes, Istio, Envoy, among others. With respect to Red Hat projects, it also hosts Submariner, Keycloak, and Strimzy as well. And there's numerous benefits to joining. So, for example, some of the benefits off the top of my head, for me, I think it would act as a platform for wider community engagement adoption. It would kind of get Kuadrant on the map. There are other benefits, such as they have a active blog that has over 45,000 subscribers to it, and members of the CNCF can then look to post on that blog. Likewise, they also have exclusive slots for conferences such as KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and there's various other benefits to doing it. So at a very high level, the foundation itself, it has like 3 main stages. We have Sandbox that's used for, or projects in the Sandbox would typically be early adoption, those that are trying to gain some traction and trying to build a community around their projects. You then have the next level, which is incubation, which is for projects that typically have a healthy pool of contributors that is used in production. So for example, the Keycloak project is in the incubation stage right now in CNCF. And then you have graduated. So that's a small subset of projects that have achieved that status. And those are the ones with strong communities behind them and are widely used in production, such as Kubernetes and Istio and Envoy. Yeah, so that's kind of the why. The work that's been done to date, really, I've only kind of looked at this over a couple of weeks at this point, but I've linked in the agenda a draft application, a document. So what I did was I looked at the submission or the process for applying to join the CNCF. And I took that form. It's in the form of a GitHub issue. So just to make things easier, I just copied the content from the GitHub issue and I dropped it into a Google Drive doc for now. So everyone should have access to it. And in there, just a little bit of context setting, kind of what I've already mentioned now. And what I'm hoping to do there is just capture a draft application where it would act as a gap analysis for us to have a look at the questions that are there, see if there's any major gaps in the project, and see if there's any potential blockers that would prevent us from proceeding or going forward with an application. So as I said, the doc is there in the agenda. It's available for everyone. So everyone should at least have comment access. So feel free to drop in any sort of comments that I definitely appreciate. People could start to contribute towards the document itself. So aside from that document, I did reach out to the Submariner team. So the Submariner team are one of the projects that have achieved Sandbox status. Speaking of one of the engineering managers there, looking for some advice and guidance on how to approach this, he gave a couple of pieces of advice. The first one was to reach out to a Red Hatter called Josh Burkus, and Josh is a Kubernetes community manager at Red Hat. So it's more kind of as an FYI, just inform Josh of our intentions to look to apply and see what his thoughts are. The second one then was to look to present to the relevant SIG. So in our case, I believe it's the network SIG, specific to Gateway API. And that's something I'm going to start to reach out to folks over the coming weeks to see if we can try to put together some sort of presentation, see how we're going to pitch this to the wider community, and then look to put ourselves forward for joining one of those SIG calls and showcasing and presenting Kuadrant and see what the feedback is there with respect to what we're looking to do. And there are other people that I'm looking to reach out to. So I've mentioned Keycloak and Strimsy. So I'm looking to reach out to some managers from there and some engineers from there and get their view on what things worked for them, what things didn't, and just kind of potential gotchas or any blockers there. So just final note then, with respect to community pitch. So I was speaking with David Martin last week, and he raised a point that I agree with, which is when it comes to pitching Quadrants to the wider community for engagement and adoption, I think the multi-cluster aspect of things is just like a side note. I think that the main thing that we should focus in on, or the main thing that we should focus in on as a group, is the policy attachment pattern for Gateway API. Thinking about it more, perhaps there's an opportunity that when we pitch this to the CNCF and the wider community, perhaps Kuadrant could be seen as an exemplar project for Gateway API policy attachment and used as an example for how to implement that pattern. So yeah, I've done a lot of talking, so I'll stay quiet now, but I'd just be interested to get people's thoughts and feedback and any potential approaches or anything we need to consider before progressing this work. Great.
I think it's really cool, but I think what I would say is I really like the idea of putting together a proposal and bringing that to the SIG, because that's what we had in our community strategy plan, if you want to call it that, in the MVP doc, is like presenting to those communities. It's something we've kind of had in our minds. So I think using this as a reason to present is probably a good excuse or a good reason. So yeah, I'd love to help out with that presentation, Paul. Yeah, other than that, I guess, is anybody here ever gone through this process in anything else that they've done, or are we all new to this?
What I would say is that even if we're all new to this as a collective group, there are a lot of Red Hatters that have gone through it. So I mentioned a few names there, and I'm actually seeking them out to try and get a steer on it. So hopefully we will have a support network internally before we look to proceed with the application.
Yeah. I think one thing that might trip us up a little bit is policy attachment is like a spec rather than like a particular enforced API, if you know what I mean. So I don't know, I might not trip us up, but it's just something that I thought of as like, it's not by calling it like where's the word you used, exemplar project for Gateway API policy attachment. I think that's probably fine, but yeah, it just made me think that, like, what does that mean to others, you know? Whereas maybe like what we have in the website is policy for Gateway API, right? Rather than policy attachment. That's more like the spec. Maybe if we just talk about policy for Gateway API, maybe that brings it across a little bit better than the attachment part. But not that we couldn't call out policy attachment as like how it's working, right? Just a thought. Yeah. Cool. Anything else on that one? All right. Philip, Peter, is it better?
Yes, both are okay, by the way. And okay, I will start the next topic, which is the, how to say it, how we should distribute Kuadrant in upstream, basically, and what the focus should be on. As far as I know, as we did only one Kuadrant release so far, even though it was only data plane. We distributed and tested it through OLM, and it was distributed basically as a catalog source that people can try. It is available on community operators where people can try the versions that are actually tested. However, so I would call data plane that I would say the data plane team currently distributes through OLM as their primary source of releases or whatever. However, for control plane, I would say that that's not the case, as the OLM is not even built yet, and instead you rely on customize. Am I right? Or
yeah. So it's using customized underneath to install bits and pieces.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask and I wanted to bring up to this group is if I think it would be a great idea if you unified it and either both did primary OLM or both did primary customize, as I think as a one project it shouldn't have multiple, deployment priorities or sources or whatever. That doesn't mean that the other cannot exist, right? That just means the focus and the testing will be done on the one part instead of on the other one.
So I think what I'd say is we're definitely going to have OLM for the multi-cluster gateway controller piece, because as it becomes a product, that's how it would be expected to be built and installed, and so that it's definitely going to be there, right? So we will definitely support OLM both upstream and downstream, I guess, right? I think so. I think the question is whether customized should stay there, right? Like,
I think customized can stay there. It's it doesn't hurt anybody. However, what I would maybe like to ask different questions when the OLM will be there.
Right.
And
so it's quite high up in our backlog. It hasn't quite made it into the sprint yet, but it's fairly high up there to create a catalog, an image for OLM.
But it's not part of the MVP, right?
No.
Okay, so MVP is not a release.
It is a release.
So we are going to release without our OLM. Is that correct currently?
So the installation process upstream, like you can use Customize to install that, and then that within that OLM is installed into their spoke clusters, and then when you install the add-on in OCM, then that triggers the installation of the Kuadrant pieces via the OLM catalog.
Right. However, what user need to do, at least as far as I know currently, is download the repo, have Go installed, have basically the entire environment installed, and then he can think about deploying it.
So we've made quite a few. So there's an issue in the sprint right now for creating an installation for Customize using if you want to install it into an existing OLM, right?
Okay.
Not OLM, OCM.
Okay.
And there's work that's just landed either yesterday or the day before around a better quick start experience. So you don't have to clone the repo anymore. You don't have to use the make files anymore. So there's a quick start there, which is basically a script which you can, I don't know if someone's got a handy link to it.
Yeah, I know about quick start. Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't force you to clone the repo or anything like that anymore.
Okay. So the quick start is sufficient on its own.
Yeah, this is like the quick start will get you a local running environment.
Okay.
With OCM installed.
Right. How do I get it on my own?
Right. That's what's being worked on in Sprint now.
Okay.
Which is to allow installation onto an existing OCM hub.
So it is expected that the installation method for the MVP is downloading a script that will kind of install it with one configuration.
Yeah.
Yeah. I understand the point of quick start script. I just don't think it, replaces the entire installation process. when
Yeah,
I
so
want to actually deploy to the semi-production cluster.
Right. So if you want to install it into an existing installation of OCM, that's what is being worked on in the current sprint, and it will use Customize to do that.
Okay. In that case, I will move out to the reason why I'm even bringing it up, and that's QE testing, of course. With Kuadrant, it works quite nicely. We can build images. We basically, the only deliverable is catalog source, which has one requirement. It needs fixed images. So we have actually a set of images that we test. We have basically a build that then we can test, run our, we can do our testing and decide, yes, this is good. This set of images is good, can be replicated, can be published, whatever. We have some assurances. And currently we don't do that for MGC. The installation process, we have very old version. We weren't able to update yet. And basically what I wanted to discuss also is how to proceed with testing MVP until
so,
the OLM is done.
Okay, so the MVP is an upstream release, right? So it's not productized in any way. So I would say that the installation method should be the customized based installation instructions that we're working on. So you should be able to install that into OpenShift at this point.
And do I need a quick start, or will I get, I don't know, some...
There's a new...
Okay.
I don't know if I'm saying it clear enough. There's an issue being worked on which will allow you to do installation into an existing OCM cluster without a quick start. The quick start sets you, the quick start brings you from nothing to a local environment with everything. What's being worked on in the sprint is I already have an OCM cluster. I want to install Kuadrant into that and use it with that OCM cluster. Those instructions are being worked on in this sprint.
Okay. I think I now kind of get it. I thought it was before with the quick start. Never mind, sorry.
And I would say also very shortly, very soon afterwards, we will also create like the bundle, the catalog bundle for MGC. So that should then you can choose to install it via OLM if that's what you want to do it. We just didn't want to force that right at this point. So it is high on our priority list, but isn't there yet.
Guy, you raised the hand.
Yes. This conversation makes me think on the battery included goal that we listed a while ago, and it makes me wonder, in the same way that for the, and I'm going to use service protection instead of data plane here, for the service protection installation, we may want to move to a place where an installation of a Kuadrant also includes all the dependencies, right? Including sometimes things like you need to install gateway API, you need to install your gateway provider, right? If you didn't have one. I now wonder if the same applies to the multi-cluster control plane components as well. And now bringing almost to a second point, because I wasn't sure if I should ask two questions or try to make it just one. Before we move to having an OLM-based distribution of the control plane component, should we consider merging those things into one single operator or one single installation way, so we don't have to maintain two different operators in the different hubs?
So I was actually talking to Alex today about this, but it is like post MVP. There's a couple of items that are on the sort of technical debt / like improved architecture list, right? One of those is to review our current set of operators and figure out, do we need all of these? Should we consolidate down? Can we reuse the Kuadrant operator for MGC and for the service protection components? So that is on the list to review post MVP. And the other piece that's sort of on the list is currently the multi-cluster gateway controller is responsible for the integration with OCM, but it also exposes the APIs around DNS policy and TLS policy. So we're Mike in particular is not here today, but is giving some thought and will be looking post MVP around whether we want to separate that out, right? So that we have a component that's responsible for the integration with OCM, and then we have a policy controller, right? And that policy controller potentially brings together all of our policy APIs, and they can work across multi or single cluster, right? So that's another thing post MVP that would like to give some focus to. While we're on post MVP, the other thing that's also probably quite high on the list is to look at supporting core DNS. The reason for that being, if we're going to be a product, some people, well, there's two reasons. One is local development, and locally using it means you wouldn't necessarily have to have like an AWS account to use it, right? And secondly, if you are like an enterprise that's very conservative and you have your, Red Hat has its own DNS service, for instance, right? Then you can offload that and name server it to an installation of core DNS running on your own clusters, and that's the thing then that becomes configured by the Kuadrant controller to do geo or weighted DNS, that kind of thing. So that's there's some of the things that are on the list, but yeah, there'll be more coming out over the next few weeks, I think, as we discuss like what we want to do post MVP. But Peter, please be assured, the OLM-based installation is high on the list.
Okay, there's one thing I need to clarify then is, so MVP for MGC, no OLM, that's fine. But for Kuadrant, for data plane, it will be OLM? Or will they both be released simultaneously as a customize, or what can basically we expect?
Yeah, so I can see the conflict there. That's sort of organically emerged. I guess I'd throw that over to Guy and Alex as well. Like, do we want to look at like what's the difficulty with using customize potentially, given that it's upstream and not everyone is like going to be using OLM in their clusters? It feels like customize is sort of the lowest common denominator potentially, that doesn't require you running like a completely new component and all that in your cluster. So I'm wondering, maybe we want to look at supporting customize for the service protection pieces as well.
I think the main discussion around this is going to be how are we going to testing it, because let's be honest, we forced data plane to do it kind of to some way. So I would actually move this discussion out of this call because we are getting quite out of time. But I would like to discuss how we are going to handle testing and, basically kind of handovers, whatever the artifacts we are going to build, how are we going to test them, what we basically require for actually testing them.
Yeah.
And
okay.
Yeah, and
so
based on that, we can discuss basically how the release will look, because it should be the same artifacts that we will test.
Yeah. So I'll set up a separate call, Peter, when Mike is back, and I'll include Alex and anybody else from the service protection side that wants to be involved, and we'll hash it out there.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right, we're out of time, but thanks everybody. I'll talk to you soon.
One question.
Oh.
So what happens to that recording now? It gets like,
I don't know. I guess it gets emailed to Paul, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so typically what happens is you'll see it added as an attachment to the calendar entry. But I can look to share it out, but it should get auto-attached, so all attendees should be able to view it.
Well, since we're on the topic, should we publish this to YouTube later? Do we need to, or it's going to be on YouTube automatically? Anybody know?
I wonder.
It's
It's going to be in Google Drive, right? Oh, it does get out. Okay.
No, I don't believe it gets auto-published to YouTube, but yeah, it is in Google Drive.
Yeah,
Maybe we should
think it's
raise it on the next community call.
Yeah, I imagine it's hosted in YouTube as any Google meeting recording usually do, but for sure not in the Kuadrant YouTube channel. So that's what I'm talking about. I think should we move that and start publishing those to the Kuadrant YouTube channel?
I can certainly take an action to do it as a follow-up because I'll have access to the recording. So if that's something we want to do, I can certainly look to facilitate.
Nice, thank you.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.